The courtroom was unusually quiet that morning. The steady rhythm of my gavel, the murmur of the clerk calling the case, and the shuffle of papers were the only sounds breaking the still air. I presided over hundreds of cases, and most mornings I approached them with the same detached resolve. But something about that day felt different, though I couldn't say why. Then he walked in. The defendant shuffled into the room, his hands cuffed and his expression hard but resigned, as if he'd already made peace with his fate. He was young, no older than 30, with a face that looked worn from a hard life. The prosecutor stood ready at their table, the defense attorney at his, both visibly prepared for a trial they clearly expected to be routine. But my focus shifted almost immediately from the formality of the proceedings to something entirely unexpected. Around the prisoner's neck hung a necklace, a simple silver chain with a small, heart-shaped pendant. My breath caught, and the words I was about to speak lodged in my throat. It couldn't be. It was impossible. 15 years ago, my daughter Lily disappeared. She had been wearing that very necklace when she left the house for what should have been a normal day. The image of her walking out the door, her auburn hair swinging against the chain around her neck, had been burned into my memory. I had given her that necklace on her 16th birthday, and she had cherished it, wearing it almost every day. Seeing it now, in this courtroom, on the neck of a stranger, someone accused of burglary and assault, felt like a blow to the chest. My carefully constructed world, the fortress of professionalism and emotional distance I'd built over the years, began to crack. The atmosphere in the courtroom seemed to shift, though I knew it was only my own perception. The sunlight streaming through the tall windows felt harsher, the murmurs in the gallery sharper. My heart raced, a tremor starting in my hands that I quickly hid beneath the desk. I couldn't afford to lose composure here, not in front of my clerk, the attorneys, the jury. Not in the seat of justice, where I was supposed to embody authority and calm. "State your name for the record," I finally managed, my voice steady despite the chaos inside me. "Michael Harris," the prisoner said, his voice gruff, but even. I forced myself to focus on his face, on the proceedings. I couldn't let my gaze linger on the pendant, couldn't let my mind spiral into questions I wasn't ready to confront. Was it truly Lily's necklace? How had he come to possess it? And more hauntingly, what could it mean? The prosecutor began laying out the charges, his words fading into the background as I tried to regain my footing. My mind was spinning, memories of Lily surfacing with painful clarity, the warmth of her laughter, the way she used to call me Judge Mom with a teasing grin, the emptiness of her room after she was gone. I had spent years trying to move forward, convincing myself that closure wasn't necessary to survive. But now, all those wounds felt fresh again. As the trial moved forward, I caught myself stealing glances at the necklace. It wasn't just similar, it was identical. The delicate etching on the heart, the way it caught the light, even the faint scratch along one edge from when Lily had accidentally dropped it years ago, it was the same. There was no doubt in my mind. By midday, I knew I had to address it, but how? What was the protocol for a judge confronting a personal connection in the middle of a trial? Was it ethical to bring it up at all? I'd spent my career enforcing fairness and objectivity, but now, my own emotions threatened to derail everything. When we broke for lunch, I retreated to my chambers, closing the door behind me with a trembling hand. I sank into my chair, staring at the wall as I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. I needed answers, but I had no idea how to get them without compromising the integrity of the trial, or myself. The questions kept coming, relentless and unyielding. Had Michael Harris known Lily? Could he have been involved in her disappearance? Or was the necklace simply a coincidence, a piece of jewelry that had somehow changed hands over the years? I pulled open my desk drawer, retrieving the photo I kept hidden there, a picture of Lily on her 17th birthday, her smile radiant, the necklace gleaming against her sweater. I hadn't looked at it in years, too afraid of the pain it brought. But now, I couldn't look away. Tears welled in my eyes, but I blinked them back, forcing myself to breathe deeply. I was Judge Joan Winters, a woman who had spent decades navigating the complexities of the law, balancing justice with humanity. I could handle this. I had to. When the trial resumed that afternoon, I felt a newfound determination. I couldn't let my emotions dictate my actions, but I also couldn't ignore the truth staring me in the face. Somewhere, somehow, this man and that necklace were connected to Lily. And I was going to find out how. As Michael Harris took the stand, I leaned forward slightly, my hands clasped tightly in front of me. The questions burned on the tip of my tongue, but I stayed silent, letting the attorneys do their work. But inside, I was watching. Waiting. Searching for the moment when the truth might finally emerge. The afternoon session began like any other, at least on the surface. I resumed my place behind the bench, my robe straightened, my expression calm. But beneath that veneer, I was anything but composed. My eyes kept drifting to the defendant, Michael Harris, and the necklace that gleamed faintly under the harsh courtroom lights. It was a distraction I couldn't afford, and yet I couldn't seem to help myself. The prosecutor's voice carried through the room, steady and confident as he laid out the state's case. "Mr. Harris," he said, "you were apprehended in possession of stolen goods, including jewelry from a residential burglary on Maple Street. Can you explain how you came into possession of those items?" Harris's expression didn't change. He leaned forward slightly, his wrists shackled, and said, "I found them." A low murmur rippled through the gallery, and I glanced at the jury. Their skepticism was palpable, mirrored by the prosecutor's incredulous tone. "You found them? In a home you were accused of breaking into?" "That's right," Harris said, his voice flat. "I didn't take anything. I just found them." The prosecutor scoffed. "And the necklace you're wearing now, Mr. Harris? Was that part of what you found?" My chest tightened as the necklace became the focus of the questioning. My pen trembled in my hand, and I set it down carefully to keep my unease from showing. Harris hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the necklace for the briefest of moments. "No," he said finally. "This is mine." The prosecutor pounced. "Yours? You're claiming you owned that necklace before the alleged burglary?" "That's right," Harris said, his voice steady but tense. "It's mine." I couldn't stop myself from interjecting. "Mr. Harris," I said, my tone measured but firm. "Do you have any proof that the necklace belongs to you?" He looked at me then, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he sensed the weight behind my question. "No," he said after a long pause. "I don't have proof." The prosecutor seized the moment. "Then how can we believe it's yours? Isn't it more likely that it's stolen, just like the other items you were caught with?" Harris didn't answer right away. He seemed to retreat inward, his jaw tightening. "It's not stolen," he said quietly. "It's personal." That word hit me like a hammer. Personal. My fingers gripped the edge of the bench as I fought to keep my composure. I wanted to demand answers, to ask him outright how he'd come to have the necklace. But I couldn't. Not here, not like this. My duty as a judge demanded impartiality, and I couldn't let my emotions derail the trial. But the questions swirled in my mind, relentless and consuming. If the necklace was personal to him, what did that mean? Had he known Lily? Had he been there when she disappeared? Or was it just an elaborate lie to protect himself? When the court recessed for the day, I retreated to my chambers, closing the door behind me with a trembling hand. I sank into my chair, my mind racing. I knew I had to tread carefully. Any action I took outside the scope of the trial could jeopardize the case and my career. But the need for answers burned too brightly to ignore. I opened my laptop, hesitating for only a moment before typing Michael Harris's name into the search bar. The results were sparse, mostly articles about his current charges and a few mentions of prior arrests for petty theft. Nothing that tied him to Lily. Nothing that explained the necklace. Frustrated, I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. The rational part of me urged caution, reminded me that the necklace could be a coincidence. But my heart was screaming that this was more than that. It had to be. The next day, as the trial continued, I paid even closer attention to Harris. I watched his body language, his expressions, the way he answered questions. He was guarded, but there were cracks in his armor. Every time the necklace was mentioned, a flicker of something crossed his face, anxiety, perhaps, or guilt. It wasn't until the defense called their first witness that a new piece of the puzzle fell into place. A woman in her 40s took the stand, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she avoided looking at Harris. "Ms. Rodriguez," the defense attorney began, "how do you know the defendant?" "We used to live in the same neighborhood," she said, her voice quiet. "He worked odd jobs for me sometimes, fixing things around the house." "And did he ever give you reason to believe he was involved in criminal activity?" She hesitated, glancing briefly at Harris, before looking down at her hands. "No," she said. "But he had a lot of stuff. Things that didn't always seem like they were his." "What do you mean by that?" the attorney asked. She shifted uncomfortably. "Like that necklace he's wearing," she said. "I've seen it before." My heart leapt, and I leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Rodriguez," I said, my voice steady but tinged with urgency. "Where have you seen the necklace?" Her eyes darted toward me, then back to her lap. "He had it years ago," she said. "Before he moved out of the neighborhood. I remember because it didn't seem like the kind of thing he'd wear." "Did he ever say where he got it?" I pressed, trying to keep my tone neutral. "No," she said. "But he was real protective of it. Never took it off." Her testimony sent a ripple through the courtroom. I could feel the eyes of the attorneys, the jury, and even Harris himself on me. I forced myself to remain calm, but inside, my mind was racing. If Harris had the necklace years ago, then he might have had it when Lily disappeared. But how? And why? As the trial continued, I knew I had to find out. The answers were closer than they had been in 15 years, and I wasn't going to let them slip away. The next day, I entered the courtroom with a sense of purpose that felt both empowering and terrifying. The necklace around Michael Harris's neck had become more than a distraction, it was a lead, a thread tied to a mystery I'd lived with for 15 years. But I couldn't act recklessly. The trial demanded impartiality, and my position as a judge left little room for personal investigations. Still, the questions burned too brightly to ignore. The morning session was uneventful, the prosecution methodically presenting its case. I found myself glancing at Harris more often than I should, studying him for clues. His demeanor was guarded but calm, as if he'd resigned himself to the outcome of the trial. But every so often, his hand would drift toward the necklace, his fingers brushing the pendant almost unconsciously. It was a small, telling gesture, one that only deepened my determination. During the lunch recess, I returned to my chambers and closed the door. I needed more information, but I had to tread carefully. Drawing attention to my interest in Harris, or the necklace, could compromise not only the trial, but my career. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was closer to answers than I had been in years. I opened my laptop and began searching for anything that might tie Harris to Lily. There were no obvious connections, no shared acquaintances, no history in our neighborhood. But the more I dug into his past, the more I noticed gaps. Periods of time where his whereabouts were unclear, his actions unaccounted for. The trial resumed after lunch, and I forced myself to focus on the proceedings. The defense had begun cross-examining a key witness, a police officer who had been present at Harris's arrest. It was standard courtroom fare, but my mind kept drifting back to the questions swirling in my head. When the officer mentioned finding the stolen goods in Harris's possession, the defense attorney pounced. "And was there any evidence that my client personally stole these items?" he asked. "No," the officer admitted. "But he couldn't explain how he came to have them." "And yet, he's accused of burglary," the attorney said, his tone sharp. "Isn't it possible that the items were simply in his possession, without him having stolen them?" The officer hesitated, clearly reluctant to concede the point. "It's possible," he said finally. "But unlikely." As the afternoon wore on, I began to piece together a plan. I couldn't directly question Harris about the necklace, not without compromising the trial. But perhaps there was another way to get the information I needed. When the session ended for the day, I lingered in the courtroom, watching as Harris was escorted out by the bailiff. His expression was unreadable, but the necklace gleamed faintly under the fluorescent lights, a haunting reminder of the past. Once the room emptied, I made my way to the clerk's office. I kept my tone casual, asking to review Harris's file under the pretense of ensuring procedural accuracy. The clerk handed it over without question, and I retreated to my chambers to examine it. The file was thin, containing little beyond the details of his current charges and a summary of his prior arrests. But one detail caught my attention, a note indicating that Harris had lived in a transient shelter for several months around the time Lily disappeared. My breath caught as I read the address. It wasn't far from where she had last been seen. Could this be the connection I was looking for? I leaned back in my chair, the file trembling in my hands. If Harris had been in the area when Lily disappeared, then he might know something, whether he realized it or not. But confronting him directly was still out of the question. I needed more. That evening, I drove to the address listed in Harris's file. The shelter was a modest, weathered building tucked between a corner store and a bus station. I parked across the street, watching as people came and went, their faces weary but determined. I debated going inside, unsure of what I was even looking for. But before I could make a decision, an older man emerged from the shelter, his gait slow but purposeful. He paused on the steps, lighting a cigarette, and I decided to take a chance. "Excuse me," I said, stepping out of my car and approaching him. "Do you have a moment?" The man eyed me warily, taking a drag from his cigarette. "Depends," he said. "What do you need?" I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I'm trying to find out more about someone who used to stay here," I said. "Michael Harris. Do you remember him?" The man exhaled a cloud of smoke, his expression softening slightly. "Yeah, I remember Mike," he said. "Quiet guy. Kept to himself most of the time. Do you know where he might have gotten a necklace?" I asked carefully. "A silver chain with a heart-shaped pendant." The man frowned, his brow furrowing in thought. "He had that necklace when he showed up here," he said finally. "Said it was his good luck charm or something." My pulse quickened. "Did he ever say where it came from?" "Nah," the man said, shaking his head. "But I always thought it was weird. Didn't seem like the kind of thing a guy like Mike would have, you know?" I nodded, my mind racing. "Thank you," I said, handing him a few dollars as a token of appreciation. The man pocketed the money, nodding in return. "Good luck," he said, taking another drag from his cigarette before disappearing into the night. As I drove home, the weight of the day settled over me. The man's words had confirmed what I already suspected. The necklace wasn't just an ordinary piece of jewelry to Harris. But how it had come into his possession, and what it meant, remained a mystery. I knew I was treading dangerous ground, blurring the line between my role as a judge and my need for answers. But as I stared at the photo of Lily on my desk that night, I knew I couldn't stop. The truth was out there, and I was closer than I'd ever been. The next morning, the weight of my discoveries made the courtroom feel heavier than usual. The trial had taken on a dual meaning for me, the professional obligation to oversee a fair and impartial proceeding, and the deeply personal quest for answers tied to the necklace around Michael Harris's neck. Each time I glanced at it, memories of Lily tugged at the edges of my resolve, but I couldn't let them consume me, not yet. The prosecutor called another witness, a pawnshop owner, who testified about the stolen goods Harris had allegedly tried to sell. The items included jewelry, watches, and other valuables, but notably, the heart-shaped necklace was absent from the list. "Did the defendant attempt to pawn the necklace he's currently wearing?" the prosecutor asked, gesturing toward Harris. "No," the witness said. "He seemed pretty protective of it. When I asked about it, he just said it wasn't for sale." I caught the briefest flicker of emotion on Harris's face. Was it fear? Defensiveness? Whatever it was, it confirmed what I already suspected, the necklace held significance for him. But what that significance was, I still didn't know. After the session ended for the day, I returned to my chambers, my mind racing. Harris's insistence that the necklace was personal, the pawnshop owner's testimony, and the shelter residents' recollection of Harris arriving with it all pointed to one conclusion: he had been holding on to it for years. But why? I pulled out Lily's photo, my hands trembling slightly. The necklace gleamed in the picture, identical to the one Harris wore. It wasn't just similar, it was hers. I was certain of it. But certainty wasn't enough, I needed proof. I picked up the phone and called an old friend in law enforcement, Detective Ben Whitaker. Ben had been a junior officer when Lily disappeared, and he had worked tirelessly on her case. Though the investigation eventually went cold, I knew he hadn't forgotten. "Joan," he said when he answered, his tone warm but cautious. "It's been a while." "I need your help," I said, skipping pleasantries. "It's about Lily." There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. "What's going on?" I explained everything, the trial, the necklace, the questions swirling in my mind. Ben listened quietly, his only interruptions the occasional hum of acknowledgement. When I finished, he said, "That's a lot, Joan. If this necklace really is Lily's, we need to verify it." "I know," I said. "But how?" "It's not like I can seize it as evidence without compromising the trial." "Leave that part to me," Ben said. "I'll look into Harris's background, see if there's anything that ties him to Lily. In the meantime, you stay focused on the case." "Thank you," I said, relief washing over me. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "You'd figure it out," he said with a small chuckle. "You always do." That evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was finally moving closer to the truth. Ben's promise to dig into Harris's past gave me hope, but it also made me realize how much I had been avoiding the deeper implications of what I might uncover. What if Harris had been involved in Lily's disappearance? What if he had hurt her? The thought made my stomach churn, but I couldn't let fear stop me. The next day, I resumed my quiet observation of Harris during the trial. The defense attorney called a character witness, a former coworker who described Harris as hardworking but private. The testimony didn't sway the jury much, but it added another piece to the puzzle: Harris was a man who kept his life tightly guarded. That afternoon, Ben called with an update. "I ran Harris's name through our system," he said. "There's nothing directly tying him to Lily, but I did find something interesting. Around the time she disappeared, Harris was arrested for a misdemeanor, loitering, of all things, in a neighborhood near her school." My heart raced. "What does that mean?" "It's thin," Ben admitted. "But it places him in the area. I'm going to dig deeper, see if anyone remembers him from back then. In the meantime, keep your eyes open." "Always," I said, my voice steady, despite the storm brewing inside me. That evening, I couldn't resist the urge to revisit the shelter where Harris had stayed. It was a risk, but the possibility of finding someone who knew more was too tempting to ignore. I approached the front desk, where a tired-looking woman greeted me. "Hi," I said, keeping my tone casual. "I'm trying to learn more about someone who stayed here a while ago, Michael Harris. Do you remember him?" She frowned, shaking her head. "That name doesn't ring a bell." "Maybe there's someone else who might know?" I asked. "Someone who's been here a long time." She hesitated, then gestured toward a back office. "You can talk to Joe. He's been here forever." I found Joe, a wiry man with a kind smile, sorting paperwork at his desk. When I mentioned Harris, he nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, I remember Mike. Kept to himself mostly. Always seemed like he was carrying a lot." "Did he ever talk about a necklace?" I asked, my heart pounding. Joe's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Yeah, I remember that necklace. He never let anyone touch it. Said it was all he had left of someone important." My breath caught. "Did he say who?" Joe shook his head. No. Just that it reminded him of a girl. Someone he lost. As I drove home, Joe's words echoed in my mind. A girl he lost. Could he have meant Lily? Or was it someone else entirely? The pieces were coming together, but the picture they painted was still incomplete. I knew I was on the brink of something monumental, but the closer I got, the more the fear crept in. What if the truth wasn't what I wanted to hear? What if it only brought more pain? But I also knew I couldn't stop now. For Lily, for myself, and for the justice I had dedicated my life to, I had to see this through. The day after my visit to the shelter, the trial resumed with an air of tension that seemed to mirror my own unease. Michael Harris sat at the defense table, his face impassive as the proceedings unfolded. The necklace still hung around his neck, its presence like a silent accusation, or a plea for answers. I couldn't decide which. I forced myself to focus on the prosecutor's next witness, a detective who had investigated the burglary Harris was accused of. His testimony was standard, detailing the evidence collected and the chain of custody. But my thoughts kept drifting to Ben's words from the night before. It places him in the area. That afternoon, Ben called again. His voice was steady, but carried an undercurrent of urgency. Joan, I found something. There was a witness back when Lily disappeared, a gas station attendant who saw a man loitering near the school. His description matches Harris. My heart raced. Why wasn't this followed up on? Ben sighed. It was a weak lead at the time, and it got buried under stronger ones that didn't pan out. But now that Harris's name has come up again, I'm going to see if the attendant is still around. Do you think it could be him? I asked, my voice trembling. I think it's worth finding out, Ben said. But you need to be careful, Joan. If Harris has something to hide, he's not going to make it easy. When court adjourned that day, I lingered in the courtroom, waiting until most of the others had left. Harris was being escorted back to holding, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. There was something in his gaze, a flicker of recognition, or perhaps defiance, that made my breath catch. Mr. Harris, I said, my tone calm but firm. A word. The bailiff hesitated, glancing between us, but I gestured for him to step back. Harris stopped, his posture wary but curious. You're a judge, he said, his voice low. You're not supposed to talk to me. And you're wearing a necklace that doesn't belong to you, I countered, keeping my voice even. I just want to know where you got it. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he said, it's mine. It's not, I said, my composure slipping for the briefest of moments. It belonged to my daughter. She disappeared 15 years ago, wearing that exact necklace. Harris's expression shifted, a flicker of something, shock? Guilt? Pain, crossing his face before he masked it again. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, his tone defensive. You do, I said, my voice trembling now. I need the truth, Michael. How did you get that necklace? He looked away, his shoulders tensing. I told you, it's mine. Mr. Harris, I said, taking a step closer. If you know anything about my daughter, if you were there, or if you saw something, you need to tell me. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't speak. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Then he said, almost too softly to hear, I didn't hurt her. The word sent a shiver down my spine. What do you mean? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. What do you know? Before he could answer, the bailiff stepped forward. We need to go, Judge. Harris turned away, his expression unreadable as he was led out of the courtroom. I stood there, my hands trembling, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. That night, Ben called with another update. I tracked down the gas station attendant, he said. He's retired now, but he remembers the man he saw near the school. Said the guy seemed nervous, like he was waiting for something. Did he say it was Harris? I asked. He's not sure, Ben admitted. But he described the same necklace. Said it stood out because it didn't seem like something a man would wear. My breath caught. What does this mean, Ben? It means we're getting closer, he said. But we still need more. The following day, I approached the defense attorney during a recess. I'd like to arrange a private meeting with your client, I said, keeping my tone professional. The attorney frowned. That's highly irregular, Your Honor. I understand, I said. But it's important. I have reason to believe he may have information about a missing person case. The attorney hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but eventually nodded. I'll speak to him, he said. When I met with Harris later that evening, it was in a sterile interview room at the courthouse. The defense attorney sat nearby, his posture tense, while Harris regarded me with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. You wanted to talk, he said, leaning back in his chair. So talk. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to remain calm. Michael, I believe you know something about my daughter, Lily. She disappeared 15 years ago, wearing that necklace. I already told you, he said, his voice defensive. I didn't hurt her. Then what happened? I pressed. How did you get the necklace? He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the table. Finally, he said, I found it. Where? I asked, my voice trembling. He hesitated, then muttered, in a park. What park? I asked urgently. When? It was years ago, he said, his tone growing agitated. I don't remember exactly. I was just passing through, and I saw it lying in the grass. I didn't think much of it. I just kept it. His words felt both like a revelation and a dead end. If he was telling the truth, then the necklace's presence in the park could mean anything. But if he wasn't, why didn't you tell anyone? I asked. If you found it, why not turn it in? He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Because I knew it meant something, he said softly. And I didn't want to get involved. As the meeting ended, I felt a mix of frustration and hope. Harris's story was thin, but it was something. If the necklace had been in the park, then maybe there were other clues waiting to be uncovered. And if Harris was lying? I didn't know what the next step was, but I knew I couldn't stop now. Lily's memory deserved answers, and I was closer to finding them than I had been in 15 years. Michael Harris's words stayed with me long after our meeting. I found it in a park. Whether he was telling the truth or crafting a lie, the park felt like the first tangible lead in years. It was a place, a starting point, and I couldn't ignore it. That evening, I sat at my desk with Lily's photo propped against my laptop, staring at a map of the city. There were several parks near the area where she had disappeared, but one stood out, Elmwood Park. It was a sprawling space filled with winding trails, dense trees, and quiet corners, too quiet, as I remembered. It had been searched during the initial investigation, but now I wondered if something had been missed. I called Ben and told him about Harris's claim. Elmwood Park, he repeated, his tone thoughtful. It makes sense. It was close to the school, and it wasn't heavily trafficked back then. If someone wanted to hide something. I need to go there, Ben, I said, cutting him off. I need to see it for myself. There was a long pause before he replied. I'll meet you there tomorrow. But Joan, this might not lead anywhere. You need to be prepared for that. I am, I said, though I wasn't sure it was true. The next morning, the park was eerily quiet when I arrived. The autumn air was crisp, and the trees were shedding their leaves, creating a golden carpet that crunched underfoot. Ben was already there, waiting near a bench with a small group of officers. Where do we start? He asked, his expression serious. Near the east entrance, I said. That's the closest spot to the school. Ben nodded, gesturing for the officers to fan out. As they began their search, I wandered along the trail, my heart pounding with every step. Memories of Lily flooded my mind, her laughter, her wide-eyed curiosity, the way she used to skip along paths like this one, her necklace catching the sunlight. I stopped near a grove of trees, the silence around me almost deafening. My eyes scanned the ground, looking for anything, a glint of metal, a disturbed patch of earth, a clue that might point to the truth. But there was nothing. Just leaves and dirt and the faint rustle of wind. "Joan." Ben's voice cut through the stillness, sharp and urgent. I turned and ran toward him, my breath hitching as I saw the look on his face. He was standing near a cluster of bushes, his hand resting on something partially buried in the dirt. "What is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. He crouched down, brushing away the soil, to reveal a small, weathered box. It was metal, rusted around the edges, and my stomach clenched as I realized how old it looked. "We're going to open it," Ben said gently. "But I need you to step back." I nodded, my hands shaking as I watched him pry the box open. Inside were a few items, a faded piece of fabric, a tarnished bracelet, and what looked like a bundle of papers. My heart sank as I realized none of them were the necklace. "Is this hers?" Ben asked, holding up the bracelet. I shook my head. "No," I whispered. "But, the fabric. It looks like the scarf she was wearing." Ben's expression darkened, and he handed the items off to an officer for evidence collection. "We'll run tests," he said. "See if there's anything else here." The discovery of the box reignited something in the investigation. Forensics teams combed the area, searching for additional clues, while Ben and I pored over the evidence. The scarf was confirmed to be Lily's, a chilling confirmation that she had been in the park. But the papers inside the box were a mystery. They were fragments of a journal, the writing faded and disjointed, but a few lines stood out. She didn't mean to leave. She didn't mean to go. I'm sorry. I didn't know what else to do. The handwriting was unfamiliar, and there was no name attached. But the words hinted at something I hadn't dared to hope for, remorse. Someone had cared about Lily, maybe even tried to help her. I returned to the courtroom the next day with a renewed sense of purpose. Michael Harris was seated at the defense table, his expression unreadable as the trial resumed. But I couldn't stop thinking about the journal fragments, about the scarf, about the connection between Harris and the park. As the prosecutor questioned a witness, I found myself watching Harris closely, searching for cracks in his facade. When his hand drifted toward the necklace again, I leaned forward. "Mr. Harris," I interrupted, my voice calm but firm. "Please remove the necklace while you are in this courtroom." His head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. "Why?" he asked, his voice defensive. "Because it is distracting," I said, my tone sharp. "And because it is not appropriate during these proceedings." Harris hesitated, glancing at his attorney, but he didn't argue further. With a reluctant sigh, he unclasped the necklace and placed it on the table in front of him. My heart pounded as I saw it lying there, a tangible connection to Lily, so close and yet so far. When court adjourned, I asked the bailiff to secure the necklace as evidence. It was a risky move, but I couldn't let it leave the room without being examined. Ben arranged for it to be sent to the lab for testing, where it would be compared against Lily's DNA. "Do you think it's hers?" Ben asked as we left the courthouse. "I know it is," I said softly. "I just need the proof." That night, I stared at Lily's photo, a sense of hope and dread warring within me. The park had given me answers, but it had also raised more questions. Who had left the box? What did the journal fragments mean? And how was Michael Harris tied to all of this? I didn't know what the next day would bring, but I was closer to the truth than I had been in 15 years. And I wasn't going to stop now. The morning the DNA results were expected, I couldn't focus on anything else. The trial was proceeding as scheduled, but my mind was elsewhere, caught between hope and fear. If the DNA confirmed the necklace belonged to Lily, it would be the first concrete evidence linking Michael Harris to her disappearance. Do we have enough to question him further? I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of determination and dread. Ben hesitated. The connection is strong, he said. But it's circumstantial. We need more, something that ties him directly to her disappearance. I nodded, my resolve hardening. Then we'll get it. That afternoon, I returned to the courtroom with a renewed sense of purpose. Harris was there, sitting at the defense table, the necklace no longer around his neck, but its presence still looming in my mind. As the proceedings continued, I couldn't help but watch him, searching for any sign that he knew what the results meant. When court adjourned, I made my way to the holding area where Harris was being detained. His attorney was already there, clearly uneasy about the meeting. Your Honor, he began, I have to object to. This isn't about the trial, I interrupted, my tone firm. This is about my daughter. Harris looked up at me, his expression wary but curious. What do you want? He asked. I want the truth, I said, stepping closer. The necklace, it belonged to my daughter, Lily. We've confirmed it with DNA. So now I'm asking you, as a mother, to tell me how you came to have it. Harris's eyes widened, and for a moment, he seemed genuinely shaken. He glanced at his attorney, who sighed but didn't intervene. You found her DNA? Harris asked, his voice almost too soft to hear. Yes, I said. We know it's hers. And we know you've had it for years. So please, Michael, tell me the truth. Where did you get it? He hesitated, his hands clenching and unclenching. I didn't take it from her, he said finally. I found it, just like I told you. Where? I pressed. In the park? He nodded slowly. It was lying there, near the edge of the trees. I didn't know it belonged to her. I didn't know anything about her. Then why keep it? I asked, my voice trembling with emotion. Why hold on to it for all these years? Harris looked down, his jaw tightening. Because it felt important, he said after a long pause. I don't know why, but I couldn't let it go. It was like it was waiting for someone to claim it. His words stirred something in me, a strange mixture of hope and despair. If he was telling the truth, then he wasn't responsible for Lily's disappearance. But if he had found the necklace in the park, then she had been there. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. Michael, I said, leaning forward, did you see anything? Anyone? Anything unusual near the park that day? He shook his head. I don't remember much, he said. I was just passing through, looking for a place to sleep. The necklace was lying there, and I picked it up. That's all. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something, fear, or perhaps guilt. I couldn't tell if he was hiding something or if he truly didn't know. After the meeting, I met Ben in the courthouse parking lot. I recounted Harris's words, my voice thick with frustration. He says he doesn't know anything, I said. But I don't believe him. Whether he's lying or not, the necklace proves he was connected to her, Ben said. We just need to figure out how. What about the journal? I asked. The fragments we found in the park. Ben sighed. Still working on it. The handwriting doesn't match Harris's, but that doesn't rule him out entirely. It could be someone else who was there. The weight of the unknown felt unbearable. For years, I had lived with the pain of not knowing, and now that I was closer to the truth, the uncertainty felt even heavier. What do we do now? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We keep digging, Ben said. Someone out there knows what happened to Lily. And we're going to find them. That night, I sat in my quiet home, Lily's photo in one hand and the lab report in the other. The necklace had brought me closer to her than I had been in 15 years, but it had also opened a door to questions I wasn't sure I was ready to face. But one thing was certain, I wasn't giving up. For Lily, for myself, and for the justice I had dedicated my life to, I would see this through. The days following the DNA confirmation were some of the longest of my life. The necklace had brought me closer to the truth, but it had also raised more questions than it answered. Michael Harris's claim that he found it in the park felt both plausible and incomplete. If he wasn't responsible for Lily's disappearance, someone else had to be. And whoever they were, they had left a trail, no matter how faint. Ben called one morning with a lead that sent a jolt through me. "Joan," he said, his tone steady but urgent, "I found someone who might have seen something. A man named Carl Harris, no relation to Michael, used to live near Elmwood Park. He says he remembers seeing something strange around the time Lily disappeared." "Strange how?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "Two men," Ben said. "Hanging around the park, looking out of place. Carl says they were acting nervous, like they didn't want to be seen. He thought about reporting it at the time, but when he heard the news about Lily, he assumed it was unrelated." "And now?" I asked, my heart pounding. "He's not so sure," Ben said. "He's agreed to talk, but he's reluctant. We'll need to handle this carefully." I met Ben at a small diner on the edge of town, where Carl Harris had agreed to meet us. He was an older man, his face weathered and his hands calloused. "Yes," Ben said, sliding into the booth across from him. "Joan's daughter, Lily. She disappeared 15 years ago. Anything you can tell us could make a difference." Carl nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "I don't know how much help I'll be," he said. "But I remember those two guys. It was a day or two before the news broke about the girl. They were by the east side of the park, near the big oak trees." "What were they doing?" I asked, my voice steady, despite the storm inside me. "Hanging around, talking in hushed voices," Carl said. "They had a box with them, like one of those metal toolboxes. Looked heavy. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it stuck with me." "Did you see their faces?" Ben asked. Carl shook his head. "Not clearly. They kept their heads down, and they were gone pretty quick. But one of them had a scar on his hand. Big one, running across the knuckles. I remember that." Ben and I exchanged a glance. A scar was a detail we could work with, something tangible in a case that had been filled with too many unknowns. "Did you see them leave?" I asked. Carl nodded. "They took the trail toward the main road. There was a car parked there, an old sedan. Red, I think. But I didn't get the plate." "Do you think you'd recognize them if you saw them again?" Ben asked. "Maybe," Carl said, his voice uncertain. "It's been a long time." As we left the diner, Ben's mind was already turning. "A scar on the knuckles and a red sedan," he muttered. "It's not much, but it's a start. What's next?" I asked, struggling to keep my emotions in check. "I'll dig into the records," Ben said. "See if anyone matching that description had ties to the area around that time. And we'll cross-reference with Michael Harris. If he was in the park, he might have seen something, or someone." "Do you think he's telling the truth?" I asked. Ben hesitated, then sighed. "I think he's holding something back. Whether it's out of fear, guilt, or something else, I don't know. But we'll find out." That evening, I couldn't shake Carl's words from my mind. Two men, a heavy box, and a scarred hand. It wasn't much, but it was more than we'd had in years. I thought about the journal fragments found in the park, the cryptic phrases that hinted at guilt and regret. Could they have belonged to one of these men? And if so, what did they mean for Lily? I pulled out Lily's photo, tracing her smile with my finger. "We're getting closer," I whispered. "I promise." The next day, Ben called with a breakthrough. "We found a name," he said, his voice filled with urgency. "Stephen Malik. He has a scar on his right hand and was linked to petty crimes in the area around the time Lily disappeared. Guess what else? He drove a red sedan." My breath caught. "Where is he now?" "He's living out of state, but I've got an address," Ben said. "We're going to pay him a visit." The trip to Malik's residence was tense, the air in the car thick with unspoken fears. Ben drove while I stared out the window, my mind racing. If Malik had been in the park that day, he might have answers I had been waiting 15 years to hear. When we arrived, Malik was hesitant to talk. His face was lined with age, his scarred hand resting on the doorframe as he regarded us warily. "I don't know anything about a missing girl," he said, his voice defensive. "Stephen," Ben said calmly, "we're not here to accuse you. We just want to know if you were in Elmwood Park 15 years ago." Malik's eyes flickered, and for a moment, I thought he might deny it. But then he sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Yeah," he said. "I was there. But I didn't do anything." "Then tell us what you saw," I said, stepping forward. "Please." He hesitated, then said, "There was another guy. My buddy, Roy. He said he had something to take care of." I didn't ask questions, but I think he was hiding something. "Hiding what?" Ben pressed. Malik shook his head. "I don't know. He had a box with him, said it was nothing. But the way he acted, I knew it wasn't good." As we left Malik's house, my heart was pounding. His words had opened a new door, one that led to Roy, a man who might hold the answers I'd been searching for. But the path ahead felt darker than ever, and I couldn't shake the fear that the truth would be more than I could bear. Tracking down Roy proved to be more difficult than either Ben or I anticipated. Malik's description was vague, an average-looking man, mid-30s at the time, with no distinctive features beyond a tendency to keep his head down. Ben combed through old records, searching for anyone who might fit the profile, while I focused on the fragments of the journal recovered in Elmwood Park. The phrase "I didn't know what else to do" echoed in my mind, a chilling hint of guilt that seemed to point to Roy. A week later, Ben called with a lead. "Joan, I think we've got him," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. "Roy Eberly. He used to live near Elmwood Park, and he has a record: small stuff, trespassing, possession of stolen property. But get this, he moved out of state shortly after Lily disappeared." "Where is he now?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Florida," Ben said. "He's been living off the grid, working odd jobs. I've got an address." "Let's go," I said without hesitation. The flight to Florida was tense and quiet. Ben was focused, reviewing the case file and making notes, while I stared out the window, my thoughts racing. If Roy had answers, this trip could change everything. But the fear of what those answers might be gnawed at me. I clutched Lily's photo in my hand, silently praying for strength. When we arrived at the address, a rundown house on the outskirts of a small town, Ben turned to me. "You ready?" he asked. "As ready as I'll ever be," I said, my voice trembling. Roy Eberly answered the door with a suspicious glare. He was older now, his hair graying and his posture hunched, but there was a nervous energy about him that set me on edge. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone defensive. "I'm Detective Whitaker," Ben said, flashing his badge. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about Elmwood Park. Specifically, about an incident that occurred 15 years ago." Roy's eyes darted between us, his hand tightening on the doorframe. "I don't know anything about that," he said quickly. "We believe you do," I said, stepping forward. "My name is Joan Winters. My daughter, Lily, disappeared 15 years ago. She was last seen near Elmwood Park." Roy's expression shifted, fear, recognition, and something darker flickered across his face. "I told you," he muttered. "I don't know anything." "Roy," Ben said firmly, "we've spoken to Stephen Malik. He told us you were in the park that day. He told us about the box." Roy's breath hitched, and he stepped back, his hand shaking. "I don't want any trouble," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't do anything to that girl." "Then tell us what happened," I said, my voice trembling with emotion. "Please." For a long moment, Roy said nothing. He stared at the floor, his hands clenched into fists, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. Finally, he sank into a chair, his shoulders slumping. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What wasn't supposed to happen?" Ben pressed, leaning forward. Roy buried his face in his hands, his voice muffled as he spoke. Steve said we were just going to scare someone. He said it was about money, that someone owed him and their kid was the leverage. I didn't want to do it, but I didn't have a choice. Steve, he was the one in charge. My blood ran cold. What did you do to my daughter? I asked, my voice shaking. Roy looked up, his eyes filled with tears. I didn't touch her, he said quickly. I swear. We grabbed her, but she fought back. She was so strong. Steve got scared. He told me to keep her quiet while he figured out what to do. Where did you take her? Ben asked, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. There was an old shed in the woods, Roy said, his voice trembling. We kept her there for a few hours, but then Steve panicked. He said we had to leave. I didn't know what else to do, so I let her go. You let her go? I repeated, my heart pounding. Where? The trail, Roy said. Near the east side of the park. I told her to run, but she was crying, and I didn't look back. I didn't see where she went. His words hit me like a tidal wave. The image of Lily running through the woods, scared and alone, was almost too much to bear. But if Roy was telling the truth, then she had escaped them. She had a chance. But what happened after? Why didn't you come forward? Ben demanded. Why not tell the police? Roy shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I was scared. Steve said he'd kill me if I talked. I didn't think anyone would believe me. What about the necklace? I asked, my voice breaking. How did Michael Harris get it? I don't know, Roy said, his voice cracking. She must have dropped it. Steve said it wasn't worth anything, so we left it. Ben and I left Roy's house in stunned silence. His story was incomplete, but it filled in gaps I had been desperate to understand. Lily had been taken, but had escaped. The necklace had been left behind, picked up later, by Michael Harris. But what happened after she ran? We need to search the park again, Ben said finally. If she made it out, there could be more evidence on the trail. And what about Steve? I asked, my voice trembling. Is he still out there? We'll find him, Ben said, his tone resolute. But first, we need to figure out where Lily went. That night, I sat in my hotel room, staring at Lily's photo. Roy's confession had brought me closer to her than I had been in years, but it also left me with a deeper ache. She had been so close to freedom, to safety. But something, or someone, had kept her from coming home. I closed my eyes, a silent promise on my lips, I won't stop until I find the truth. The morning we returned to Elmwood Park, the air was thick with anticipation. Roy's confession had opened a door to the truth, but the most crucial answers still lay ahead. If Lily had escaped, as Roy claimed, then the trail near the east side of the park might hold the key to what happened next. Ben and his team arrived early, setting up a perimeter and preparing to comb the area with fresh eyes and updated technology. As I stood near the trailhead, staring into the dense woods, my mind raced with questions. How far had Lily run? Had someone helped her, or hurt her? And why had she never come home? The search began methodically, with officers moving in a grid pattern, scanning the ground for anything that might have been missed during the initial investigation. I stayed close to Ben, my heart pounding with every step. Joan, Ben said gently, if this gets to be too much. I need to be here, I said firmly, cutting him off. For Lily. He nodded, his expression somber. We'll find something. Hours passed with no sign of anything new. The woods were eerily quiet, the only sounds the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional murmur of voices. I tried to remain hopeful, but the weight of the years, and the uncertainty, was beginning to take its toll. Then one of the officers called out. Over here. I've got something. Ben and I rushed toward the sound, my chest tightening with every step. The officer was crouched near a cluster of rocks, holding up what appeared to be a small piece of fabric. It's torn, but it's been here a while, he said, handing it to Ben. I stared at it, my breath catching. The color was faint, but I recognized it instantly, the same shade of pink as the sweater Lily had been wearing the day she disappeared. "It's hers," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It has to be." Ben nodded, his jaw tightening. "Bag it," he told the officer. "And keep searching." The discovery of the fabric reignited the search. Officers combed the area with renewed urgency, and it wasn't long before they found more: a shoe, partially buried in the dirt, a rusted hair clip, tangled in the roots of a tree. Each item felt like a piece of Lily's presence, haunting and heartbreaking. But it was what they found next that brought everything into focus. Near the edge of the trail, hidden beneath years of debris, one of the officers uncovered a small, weathered notebook. The cover was faded and torn, but the pages inside were remarkably intact. Ben carefully opened it, his eyes scanning the first few lines, before he froze. "Joan," he said softly, turning the notebook toward me. I took it with trembling hands, my eyes locking onto the familiar handwriting. It was Lily's. The notebook was a journal, filled with fragments of her thoughts and feelings from those final days. As I read, tears blurred my vision, but I forced myself to keep going. She wrote about being scared, about running through the woods, about hiding from men she described as angry and dangerous. But there was also a glimmer of hope, mentions of someone she trusted, someone who had tried to help her. "I found a woman. She said she'd take me to safety. I think I can trust her." The last entry was chillingly simple: "I hope Mom knows I'm trying to come home." The discovery of the journal brought both answers and new questions. Who was the woman Lily had found? Why hadn't she made it home? And where had she gone after leaving the park? Ben worked tirelessly to follow the new leads, digging into missing persons reports and cross-referencing them with Roy's timeline. Meanwhile, I clung to the journal, reading and rereading Lily's words, searching for clues I might have missed. A breakthrough came when Ben uncovered a report about a woman named Nancy Clay, who had been living near the park at the time. She was known for taking in runaways and vulnerable youth, often helping them get back on their feet. But Nancy had died in a car accident not long after Lily disappeared, leaving behind little more than rumors and unanswered questions. "We think Nancy might have been the one Lily trusted," Ben said. "If that's true, then she might have taken Lily somewhere before she passed." "But where?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Why didn't she bring her home?" "I don't know," Ben said. "But we're close, Joan. I can feel it." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place a week later, when a social worker came forward with a stunning revelation. She had been working in the area at the time and remembered a young girl matching Lily's description being brought to her office by Nancy Clay. The girl had been frightened, refusing to give her real name, and had run away before they could intervene. She said she was trying to get to her mom, the social worker recalled. "I always wondered what happened to her." The trail led to a bus station, where records confirmed that a girl fitting Lily's description had purchased a ticket to another city. But beyond that, the trail went cold. Lily had slipped through the cracks, lost in the chaos of a broken system. Standing in the park one last time, holding Lily's journal in my hands, I felt a mix of grief and hope. I still didn't have all the answers, but I knew more than I had before. Lily had fought to come home. She had found kindness in a stranger and had never given up hope. And though the road ahead was uncertain, I felt closer to her than I had in years. "I'll keep looking," I whispered, the wind carrying my words through the trees. "I'll find you, Lily. I promise." If you've enjoyed my story, please leave your comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, where your support means the world to me. I look forward to bringing you more stories that inspires growth, joy, and purpose. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.